Chapter 1. They met in April of 1992. It was the 22nd to be precise. Hormones raging, caught between adolescence and adulthood. He was 12, she 13. After the awkward flirting, Kel invited Tim to take a ride on her four-wheeler around some trails. They were in the Lake of Ozarks after all, and it was spring. As dusk approached, Kel and Tim found themselves lost in the deep, darkening wood. Young as they were, it was easy to be nervous with the bugs and the coyotes and the bears. Without the aid of cellular technology, they decided they'd make out until they came up with a better plan. Parents were gonna be pissed. Then, when the night had truly settled and nothing could be seen but the deep, dark black and the winking infinity overhead, the light came. Kel noticed it first and thought perhaps someone had lit a campfire. Rays of yellow and orange warmth illuminated the darkness. Tim saw it too. The light wasn't normal, though. No. It was too luminous for a campfire, much too bright, as if someone had caught hold of a miniature sun and set it out for a short display. Blinded at first, the light faded to the point where the lost youngsters could make out vague shapes. Human shapes. Shadows they were, nothing more. Kel and Tim watched the shadows dance, silhouettes spinning and turning around the light. As their vision adjusted, Tim noticed that the light was from a fire, but the fire was in a small pit next to what appeared to be an altar. Kel viewed the silhouettes in more detail when she could see more fully. A man and a woman, adults, old, but they were cloaked in black and Kel could not make out their faces. Tim and Kel watched the two grown-ups in their weird black outfits stop dancing and turn. When the adult strangers turned, they raised their arms, unfolding their black cloaks more fully. Kel and Tim watched the two adults wave their arms more intensely, as if frightened. Then there came two gunshots. The dark-garbed strangers fell. Kel screamed. Tim grabbed her. They ran quickly back to the four-wheeler, but Kel had trouble starting it. "Come on!" Tim screamed. Finally, the vehicle sputtered to protesting life, and Kel managed to get the beast into gear. Tim gripped onto Kel's waist for dear life as the two tore through the underbrush, limbs whipping and thorns biting them. Eventually, they found their way back to their cabins, and Tim watched the eerie light fade to black, thinking about how he heard the gunshots, 2 of them. But usually there's a report, an echo that the gun blast makes. Tim didn't hear that echo. Chapter 3. At the age of 16, Tim had long forgotten the incident, and so had Kel, now 17. They were busy exploring each other the way young lovers tend to do, compulsively, as if every touch was their last, every embrace a sanctuary, every kiss held special meaning, every moment a chance to steal themselves away from the world and meld into one. On the way back to their respective cabins from one such outing, they stopped by the local gas station to try, unsuccessfully, to buy cigarettes. Inside, Kel and Tim watched a strange hermit of a man struggle with several plastic bags as he left. The scraggly loner had wild, unkempt hair and a bushy, bristly beard. He surveyed the pair with wild eyes before leaving. "What's the story with that dude?" Kel thumbed over her shoulder as the drifter left. The clerk looked at her. "Hogan. Lives up on the bluff. I know he looks scraggly, but he keeps to himself. Doesn't hurt no one." The old lady leered at Kel over her thick glasses. "And you'd be best to just leave him be. Now what can I do for you, little lady?" Kel asked for a pack of Newports. The old clerk laughed, and when Kel stood dumbstruck with a blank expression, the old woman laughed even harder. This drew quizzical looks from other patrons, and, her cheeks turning red, Kel ran outside. Waiting for her, on the back of her four-wheeler, Tim was staring at the mountain man, Hogan, who was loading his groceries haphazardly into the back of a rusted, beat-up Jeep. Tim looked down at the empty hands of Kel. "No smokes? God damn it." Kel's voice raised defensively. She wouldn't even look at my ID. It was fake, of course, but that wasn't the point. She glanced over at Hogan and noted that while he may be a mountain man, he certainly wasn't a mountain of a man. He was 5'8" tops, and though he had a big beard and long hair, he was wiry. Kel thought maybe if you took off the bulky leather coat and cleaned Hogan up, he was all shredded and lean and muscly veins. Maybe built like Spider-Man or Legolas from The Lord of the Rings. "Hey!" Tim shouted at her. Kel shook her head and mounted her four-wheeler, with Tim gripping hold of her waist. Wordlessly, Hogan tossed her a half a pack of Winstons and closed the driver door of the Jeep. He stared at the battered vehicle, then peeled out of the parking lot. Tim opened his mouth, then closed it. He opened it once more to say something, but Kel abruptly stuffed a Winston into his mouth. We're going, she sighed. Chapter 4. Hogan had seen the strange sight in the woods. It was on his property after all. His shack sat upon a bluff. This ridge overlooked a valley which held a small creek in its gorge. Thickened wood, tall oak, and hardy cedars lined all sides. You couldn't get to Hogan's place by paved road, and he had to traverse the muddy potholes and gravel with his beat-up warhorse Jeep. He knew one day, one winter or one bad storm would take this old dirt road out for good, and then he'd be stuck. Hogan didn't see it the first time it happened, back in '92. He saw it a few years later, while he sat on his rickety porch. It was a faint fairy glow, and it didn't look to him like firelight. Certainly didn't look like two people dancing round a camp blaze. Hogan drunkenly made his way a couple of acres down the ridge, then about a football field across the valley. It was April 22nd, 1995, when he beheld what appeared to be a murder in the woods, a year before he tossed Kel that pack of smokes. Hogan reported the incident, but the police knew him to be an alcoholic hermit and passed the events off as nothing more than a hallucination. They even convinced Hogan himself finally. He had gone back to that same spot the next night, but seen nothing. The night after that, nothing. Quiet, darkened forest. A week later, Hogan stood in the middle of nowhere, sipping from a plastic vodka bottle, and lit a cigarette. He then gave up and figured the whole damn thing was just a hallucination, just like the damn cops had said. He shook his head, and Hogan thought himself a lunatic. A stupid old damn fool lunatic. And he went home. Hogan didn't know the pattern at the time, the yearly occurrence on April 22nd. He would eventually correct this mistake. Chapter 5. April 22nd, 1999. Kel connected to CompuServe and commenced her Lycos search. Her curiosity about the strange yearly phenomenon in the woods was only heightened by the frenzy surrounding the Blair Witch Project. Kel's newly installed connection of 56.6 kbps allowed her to browse the history of the occult and witchcraft in a way she never could at the local library. As she perused web pages on magic and sorcery, she felt Tim nibble on the nape of her neck. And though it gave her chills, she had other things on her mind. Before he could help himself and cup her breasts, Kel intercepted and gripped his wrists, then guided his hands to the desk beside her. He pecked her cheek, then said, "What are you looking up? That creepy shit in the woods?" "What else? They made a movie about what we've been dealing with for almost a decade. You got the camping crap all ready to go?" Kel impatiently glanced behind her at the pile of luggage. Tim had graduated early, and his gift was a camping trip by the lake. He was excited about getting drunk and laid. Kel was more interested in getting the haunting on film and finding a way to cash in at Hollywood. Hours later, the camping gear was stowed, and Tim was geared to go. Kel, however, had been sucked into her research, unable to tear herself away from the bizarre world she'd never before stepped into. Salem witch trials, the history of the Druids, blood and sex rituals. The really crazy thing was how far back in the ages all of this shit stretched. Thousands of years. Kel wondered how she'd never heard of any of this, and perhaps if there was an explanation somewhere here waiting for her. Tim, keen to get wasted and fool around, lost his patience. Kel finally relented, grabbed her camcorder and purse, and left wondering what they'd see. And what, if anything, she could capture on film. Hogan saw them that night. He'd seen the occurrence in the woods a few times now over the past 8 years, but he hadn't managed to figure out the cycle. That would come later. At first he thought it was the ghosts, the fairy light, but through binoculars, even a drunkard shut-in could see it was just some stupid kids. They were setting up tents and had a little fire going in the middle of the valley. Technically, they weren't on his property anyway. Friggin' dumbass kids, Hogan grumbled. He tossed his smoke into the old coffee can, which overflowed with cigarette butts. He went inside. He passed out. But he would see the ghost light again. Tim and Kel finished setting up camp. They enjoyed their drinks, with Tim drinking vastly more than Kel, and the two had very brief, quite clumsy sex. It didn't last long, and Tim ended up passing out. Kel wasn't quite sleepy. She found herself stirring outside, and after peeing, got something to eat. Kel sobered up. She was preoccupied with the thoughts of the supernatural and looked across the gorge to the darkened woods. She chugged a bottle of water. She zipped up the tent for Tim. When she turned, she could see the strange, eerie light in the brooding, gloomy forest. It grew brighter in luminescence and almost seemed enchanting when accompanied by the sounds of the deep night. Then Kel gathered her camera, and she traipsed off into the woods in search of ghosts. Chapter 6. It starts with gunfire, Kel explained as she tried to filter the audio. Before the 2 different shots, she adjusted the tone and pitch. You can hear the woman talking. Sounds like she's casting a spell. Graham rubbed his eyes. As her editor, he'd given her plenty of room, plenty of leeway. Now he sighed. Now it was enough. Kel had been a photographer for Ozark Dispatch for a couple of years. She'd worked her way up from filming puff pieces, and Graham had given her a section in the paper all her own. Gozark, Ghosts of the Ozarks. Kel, look, I can't keep funneling resources into this supernatural crap. Seriously, all you need to do is... Kel. She interrupted, handing him an earbud. Please. Graham reluctantly placed the listening device into his ear, and despite his doubts and skepticism, he could clearly hear a woman's voice. Kel had slowed the voice down, which made the utterance all the more creepy. Anal, Nothrock, Uthvas, Bethud. The electronic voice phenomenon trailed off into nothingness. What was that, Russian? Latin? Celtic, Kel perked up. The corners of her mouth were upturned, poised and ready for a giant grin. Graham blinked, then glanced over at Kel dubiously. Fine. This one last sojourn, and then you're done, got it? We can't send you all over creation one. Kel jumped up from her seat and threw her arms around Graham despite herself. Thank you, thank you, thank you. He cleared his throat and nodded. A polite smile crept across his face. You're welcome, yes, feel free to disentangle yourself. I don't swing that way. Kel still grinned as she stepped back. Right, sorry, excited. And she took hold of her prepared rolling case, zipping out of the office. Graham glanced at the plane ticket in his hands. April 22nd, 2002, and yelled after her. You forget something? Chapter 7. When you can't figure something out, when your mind can't decide something, when your waking thoughts don't resolve that ever-present puzzle, it's common to have nightmares. Kel's stress dreaming led to her riding a horse, a beautiful black mare. The gorgeous filly swayed as it took her into a deep, dark forest in the darkness. It was one of those dreams where you could swear it was real. You could remember it for years after. This literal nightmare carried Kel to her subconscious to confront that which she could not understand. Through the decades, Kel had inundated herself with the occult, with these bizarre, ancient, otherworldly images and spells, desperate to unlock the key what was happening in those woods. The first thing Kel noticed was her dress. She was wearing a silky nightgown. There was a pronounced bump under her breasts. Kel was pregnant. Riding the horse slowly into the forest of her mind, Kel became preoccupied with the baby. She felt the tiny thing kick. To her horror, when she felt the edges of the baby's feet, they were deformed. They were hooves. Frantically, her heart racing in the nightmare, Kel slowly slid up her silver, silken evening dress. Her legs were hairy and bowed outward. They were animal legs, and they ended in gnarled gray hooves. Kel was terrified. The mare bucked her, and she landed on her back. She was no longer pregnant. In the nightmare, the moment she hit the ground, her baby jumped out of her. It was a demonic, ghastly ghoul. Twisted antler branches protruded from a too large skull, under which hung dead, soulless eyes that nevertheless twinkled in some vague evil delight. The infant's body was nothing but a skeleton, and that skeleton itself seemed somehow carved out of wood. This hideous, deranged devil-child pointed at its mother. In the dream, Kel screamed. In reality, she probably did so as well. Running from her baby, Kel tripped and fell near a pond. Even though it was a dream, Kel could clearly see her reflection in the moonlit water. She bore the head of a goat, with 2 giant ram horns curling on either side of the beady black holes where her eyes should have been. Again screaming, terrified, she ran. Kel could hear her troll baby laughing, a nauseating screech behind her. Finally, she reached a clearing and saw a man standing in front of her. He held a shotgun. He loaded it. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't psychotic. He was terrified. His hands shook as he took aim. Kel shouted at the top of her lungs for him to stop. Kel awoke, straight up, back tense. She must have been holding her breath because her lungs hurt. She finally sighed, her chest heaving back and forth in exertion. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and Kel wiped it away, then noticed the time. April 22nd, 2011. The clock read 11:22 p.m. Jesus Christ. Achy, Kel sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed her tired eyes. She stood and walked into the living room, seeing the unconscious form of Tim passed out drunk on the couch. They'd been arguing earlier. When Kel devoted her conscious thought once more to the disappointment she felt in her boyfriend, the vivid architecture of her nightmare began to disintegrate. They'd been together for 19 years, and yet Tim wouldn't commit. The couple had been haunted, changed over the years by what had happened to them in the forest. Kel confronted the shared psychosis, actively on supernatural chat rooms, learning electromagnetic indicator equipment, studying up on quantum theory, conducting her own ghost studies. Tim? Well, Tim watched canines and convicts and played video games and drank too much. Too much. Too much of all 3, really. Tim was running away from that god-awful phenomenon in the dark woods. Classic avoidance. Kel got fired from the Ozark paper, the Dispatch, whatever the hell it was. Byline be damned. Articles be damned. She'd make a name for herself in the world of the paranormal. Write books, create documentaries, direct alien and ghost shows. Become a supernatural celebrity. Then Kel looked at her oblivious boyfriend and stared out the window, watching the rain come down in Branson, one of the few nuclear-powered cities in the country. Maybe it was the radiation. Maybe that, combined with the lack of answers, was scrambling her brain. And obsessing about the déjà vu ghost in the scary Groundhog Day forest was making things all the worse. Kel had been out of work for a year or so. So had Tim. Their unemployment was about to run out, and their rent was frickin' due. Time for her to wake up. Time for both of them to wake up. The two wouldn't return to the phenomenon for almost a dozen years. Hogan shared a nightmare that night. A nightmare he didn't understand. A dark dream he would never come to terms with. He was being chased by something. Something goddamned huge. He ran until he was out of breath, but the air was stale and he couldn't get a good foothold. And suddenly it was darker and Hogan was fumbling for his shotgun. His hands were trembling in terror as he spun to face the demon in his dream. The skinwalker stood several stories tall, towering over Hogan from the mists of ancient Indian legend. Hogan dropped the weapon. There were 2 shots. The last thing he saw before he awoke were the 2 eyes of the demonic beast, bearing down on him from the horrific black like floodlights on a freight train. Hogan's eyes snapped open. On the television was some old Western film, a train coming through a tunnel in grainy black and white. The horn blared and Hogan sat up, then fumbled for the remote and turned the frickin' thing off. But he wasn't sure he was happy with the silence which followed. As he stood up from his dingy futon, he gazed at the time on the digital clock face. 4:22:11 at 11:22:04 p.m. He watched the time turn to 11:22:05, then 06, then 07. The seconds continued to 08 and 09, and so on. And then Hogan finally let himself blink. He walked out to the porch, lit a cigarette, and put on his binoculars. Sure enough, the strange light was in the woods. The deep, dark forest was haunted by something. Hogan had enough, and he decided he would be there from now on. Every year. For the next 11 years. By design or coincidence, these are the 11 years in which Kel and Tim did not bear witness to the annual event. Chapter 9. Not a chance, came Tim's response. His image on the other end of the Zoom call appeared rough, disheveled. I got contracted, okay? I'm gonna make a bona fide documentary. What, like that Spirit Trackers show? Exactly, like the ones on the Science or Travel or History networks. This bullshit again. Why can't you just let go of this? $50,000. That's goddamned why. Tim's mouth hung open. Are you for real with me right now? Kel rubbed her forehead and sighed. Yes, Tim. I will split the retainer fee. That means half for you. $25,000 for a night's work. Are you propositioning me? That's not funny. Yes or no? I know for a fact you could use the cash. Long silence. Less than 24 hours later, and Tim was back in the Ozarks, far from his cramped apartment in cramped Chicago. He regretted it the moment he touched down on the plane. He and Kel didn't put up much of a pretense in the way of small talk. Seemed like the moment he entered her little red sedan, he was 12 years old again, and she was off on a tangent about ghosts and witches. The slip of paper contained the words, Anil, Nathrak, Uthvas, Bithud, Dakil, D. Inve. And, of course, Tim knew the words. The strange, creepy, weird electronic voice phenomenon that Kel had once recorded over a decade ago. I'm guessing you finally figured this crap out? Ancient Celtic, rediscovered in the letters of Ogam, which was a type of rune system. Tim said nothing. He was staring out the window now at the thunderstorm. Kel continued. These words come from an oral tradition that stretches back in Celtic history and myths for eons. Just eons. These words are like 6,000 years old, for God's sake. Tim slowly nodded and pinched the bridge of his nose. He had a hangover, as usual. Hang on. Kel stopped at the gas station and, much to her surprise, found the owner was still manning the register. The old lady was much older now, and plumper, and the business itself was worn and run down from the decades. Hi there. Kel greeted the silver hair an octave higher than her normal register. She was nervous for some reason. Kel ordered an extremely expensive pack of natural American spirit cigarettes. I'm here to work on a documentary about some local hauntings in the woods. I was wondering if you knew anything about... I remember you, the old clerk interrupted. You've been obsessed with that fairy light since you were a youngster. Kel was taken aback and struggled to find words. You're not the only one. Hogan lives up the ridge. He kept on keeping on with that ghost nonsense. What happened to him? The old woman shrugged. He lost his ever-loving mind. Last time he was in town, he was belligerent, barely coherent, raving some idiocy about goat heads and witches. He bought a crate of liquor and a crate of ammunition. That was 5 years ago. What about you? Long after sunset and way past midnight when you gaze into that dark forest. Have you ever seen a light? The elderly clerk looked past Kel's shoulder at the car. Inside, Tim was trying his best to make it obvious he'd rather be absolutely anywhere else. Y'all two still together after all this time? How sweet. Kel shook her head so hard it popped her neck. No, we broke up about 5 years ago. The old woman handed Kel her change. Sorry to hear that. Well then, the silver hair remarked. Well then, Kel replied and walked out the door for the last time. The pair arrived in the clearing of the valley. Kel steered her sedan off-road, and they were gliding through a grass-strewn field, haze and fog gathering over the creek gorge in the distance. Kel started recording on her smartphone. This is Crystal Hierophant, and with me is Timothy Cleric. The date is... She glanced at the face of her iPhone for confirmation. Tim interrupted. You've got to be kidding me. April 22nd, 2002, Kel finished. Tim held up a dark robe, the color of charcoal. What the hell is this? Kel turned off the vehicle and reached down into her bag, then pulled out a device which she said was an EMP register device. Its sensors are accurate to within 3 meters, but only if not interfered with by other electromagnetic fields, like the kind produced by the human body. Kel held up her own dark-colored cloak. These have a special lining to mask our signature so we don't blow the readings. Tim shook his head in dismay. Kel opened the door and locked the car behind her, turning on her devices. She watched Tim hesitantly place on the dark hooded cloak. She put on hers and gazed down at the EVP recorder. Nothing but static so far. Tim noted that it seemed to take ice ages for them to reach the original area, the clearing that they'd been to years and years earlier. Kel followed the GPS coordinates that her cell phone provided, and after passing through the threshold of the underbrush, they were embraced by the enchanting darkness of the forest. Tim was terrified, and Kel was thrilled when they reached the exact spot. Kel was getting a reading on her EVP already. The electronic voice phenomenon was female voice, faint but somewhat audible. Anal, Nathrak, Uthvas, Bithad. Wait, Kel. Tim was reaching for her. The EVP phenomenon concluded in a static-ridden echo. Dak-il, di-in-vei. Kel, that was your voice. Tim suddenly broke through as the strange garbled noises died. The EVP started again, the exact same voice, the exact same words, the exact same timbre and pitch, as if on a loop. Anal, Nathrak. Kel shook her head and lit a flare. It's not my voice. It's not even... Jesus Christ! Tim screamed. He was pointing at the ram's head. The dismembered goat lay haphazardly on a nearby stump. Eerie light from Kel's flare cast deep, unnatural crimson and indigo rays about them. Murky shadows danced in the empty sockets of the ram's head, making it briefly appear to be watching them. Kel's voice cracked over the EMP, but Kel refused to believe it was her voice. Tim shouted at her that it was the same ram's head he'd seen when he was 12, back in 1992. She couldn't seem to comprehend what he was saying. Kel dropped the flare, and the brush behind her erupted into unholy licks of violet, green, and cobalt flame. Tim was pointing. Kel turned. Kel and Tim both raised their hands, waving helplessly to try to stop what was happening. Hogan was standing in front of them, speech slurred so badly that he was incoherent. He'd been driven insane. The unnatural glare of the purple and green fire danced in his mad eyes as they streaked tears down his dirt-ridden cheeks. Hogan raised his weapon, leveling the loaded shotgun at Kel and Tim. He pulled the trigger.